So, welcome everyone. My name is Ben Aris. I'm the editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. We cover emerging Europe and North Africa. I'm joined today by Jock Mendoza-Wilson, who's an old friend and also the chief spokesman for SCM, the holding group for Ukraine's biggest businessman, RInat Akhmetov. And we're hoping to talk to Jock and get an update on what the mood is in Kyiv. And secondly, I also want to speak specifically about, from a business perspective, how all this instability is affecting business people. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants a war. Ukraine is in the process of transition. These companies are building a new economy, and all of this must be a huge pain in the neck. And then finally, to look specifically at this oligarch issue, that Zelensky last year launched this anti-oligarch campaign that IFIs have been pushing for it. But at the same time, these are the biggest companies in the country with the most money. They're investing, they're modernizing, they want to make profits. So they're a good thing to an extent. Maybe Jock can give us some feedback on that. On a technical note, we're doing this on Zoom. There'll be a recorded version on our YouTube channel at the end, and we're also streaming, so hello to everyone on Twitter. You can go and see this afterwards on YouTube, and I invite everybody to go to bneintellinews.com/welcome, where you can find the links to all of these, also to sign up for our Editor's Picks, which is our daily digest, which I recommend. So let's dive in. Jock, good to see you. I was joking. How, I guess the most normal English question would be, how's the weather? But it's actually kind of pertinent these days, isn't it? Is the ground frozen?
Well, I think, firstly, the weather is unseasonably mild. Right. I think it's about 2 or 3 degrees plus in Kyiv this morning when I was out earlier. And it's been all over a relatively mild winter. I know there maybe some of us that there's listening or amongst us who are military strategists or think they are. And a lot of discussion has been about whether super cold weather would make an ground invasion more likely, because it would make it easier to move mechanized armaments, tanks, and supply chains into place. However, I think that point is well overrated. I think other issues are far more important than that. I'm sure we'll come on to them in this discussion, but it's nice to be here today, and thank you very much for the invitation.
You're welcome. But is it still sub-zero, or is it just right on
the
edge?
It's plus. No, it's plus. It's been hovering for the last week between plus and minus, and at the moment the snow is melting, and it was really, I think it must have been about +4 when I went out this morning. So right. No, it feels, if you've lived in this region, and some of the people on this call have probably lived in this region, worked in this region, it's unseasonably mild for February. I would have expected still to be in sub-zero temperatures and snow on the ground. It feels a little bit more like the early days of March than the early days of February. I'm not sure what that means from a security point of view, but for someone living here, it's quite pleasant.
So, look, come to the main question. What's the mood like? Because you must be aware in the West, English language press, I mean, there's been this hue and cry. I mean, there's been all this, I don't want to say the word warmongering to give away my bias on this particular issue, but there's definitely a lot of fear, a lot of reporting, a lot of intel being issued, a lot of it coming out of Washington. However, the reports coming from Kyiv seem to paint a much calmer picture. We have a correspondent there, and he wrote a piece last week when Vox Pop people, and nobody seemed to mind. Having said that, we sent him out to the regions and to the east, where he is at the moment. I talked to him this morning, and he says there people are a little bit more concerned that, a lot of people are dismissive, but there are people making evacuation plans, putting a suitcase together, bought some supplies. And what's your general impression? I think the situation in Kyiv is different from the east.
I've been in both. I've been in the east. Last was in December, in Mariupol, where I go frequently. You may know that Metinvest, which is the metals and mining business of SCM, has 2 large steel plants which are in Mariupol. I also sit on the advisory board of the university in Mariupol. So I was there, and I think obviously, you're only 36 kilometers from the contact line. And so there is a greater understanding the real human risk that people face if there is a conflict. Nonetheless, everything was going ahead as per normal, but with a very strong sense of patriotism towards Ukraine. And I think that the closer, if you are in the East, the closer you go to the East, the more you feel the tension and the possible conflict with Russia. And the more people that are in that region who understand the consequences of war, having been through war already in 2014 and suffered that dislocation, in some cases, a great personal loss. So the closer you are to the heat of the conflict or potential conflict, the more the concern is. To reflect back here in Kyiv, where I am today and where I'm based, I think it's fair to say that people talk about the war. It is the current security situation is the talk of the day. Nonetheless, we'd all rather, and we all as much as possible, get on with doing the normal business of business where that's possible. So we're not spending our days worrying about war. We're trying to get on with the business plans we have, the plans we have for the future, whether it's in our business lives or in our personal lives, because it's impossible for us to predict the situation with regard to conflict. I think I remember speaking to you back in April last year, when military build-up first began on Ukraine's border, and it hasn't ceased since that point. There was a period in summer when there was a step back, but since then, we've by and large lived in one way or another with the threat of conflict, or at least the increased security build-up along Ukraine's border. So I would say that the question is calm.
There's calm.
But aware.
Indeed. Well, we have to make a distinction here because, of course, Ukraine has been at war for around 8 years. It'll be in May, won't it? And yes. So the country's lived with war, and it's always been an issue. People wanted to end this fighting in Donbass. However, has it changed in any noticeable way that people feel an increase in the threat? I mean, how likely do they think that there's going to be some sort of renewed military action outside of Donbass? Possibly Kyiv could be taken, or the land bridge down Novorossiysk down to Crimea is another option. There's been talk possibly of Russians bombing all these munitions that are coming in from the West, just sort of taking out an airfield or two. I mean, do people, do they calculate that into their thinking?
Most people are probably still of the viewpoint that this will be resolved in a peaceful manner. And in fact, in all probability, we're still heading to a situation where the most likely resolution to the security standoff is some form of peaceful and diplomatic resolution. That's not to say that the threat is not real. It is very real. And the increased reporting of it makes it realer for citizens. But it's not something that prevents us going around our everyday jobs or our activities. If you go to the opera, it works. If you go to a bar or restaurant, it works. What have I noticed that's different? I've noticed that people talk about the possibility of conflict. And there was in answer to your question, there was probably a moment when people's attitudes changed towards the threat of conflict. It was seen as primarily newspaper talk, and particularly Western newspaper talk at that. However, at the point at which the Americans and the British announced that they would reduce their level of diplomatic mission and move non-essential staff out of Ukraine, that was a point where Ukrainians sat up and took notice. They realized that if those two powers, which are deeply respected, were moving their staff away from Kyiv, that it would, or at least some of their staff away from Kyiv, that this was a threat that needed to be taken seriously. And from that point onwards, you started seeing people taking, perhaps in some cases, normal and sensible precautions in case the security situation should deteriorate. So, simple things like, putting in some key supplies of groceries, tinned goods, non-perishables, thinking about what they might do should conflict begin, maybe thinking of moving kids and children and so on out of areas that might be potential targets, beginning to perhaps take more focus and look at the news on how the situation was evolving. Nonetheless, all of that was quite calm. So if you want to describe the situation, it's probably calm, but tense. People are calm, going about their business, but nonetheless, there is the knowledge in their minds that there's a possibility that there could be an uptick in conflict. And the question, if there was a conflict, would be how would that involve them or impact them? Remembering that in the past, it was on mostly in the East.
Would you characterize it then? It sounds like you're saying that people are just being prudent as opposed to prepared, that, you know, this is in the air, it could happen. And so you make some precautions just in case, but you're not actually getting ready for a war. Yeah.
Yes, that's how I would describe it. Yes.
And in terms of people who've left, I mean, again, our correspondent's saying like some rich people sent their kids abroad because, you know, they can and why not. But on the whole, and amongst the diplomatic community, we talked to a British diplomat who'd sent his family home, although there's no official advisory by the foreign ministry to pull British diplomats out. Although I think I saw on the wires this morning that Biden said yesterday or today that people should leave. And there's a travel advisory as well from the States against going to Ukraine. Yeah. Do you know anyone?
I know that
left?
After Biden's advisory last night, where he said that the threat, again, the Americans have dialed up and dialed down their viewpoint of the threat. It was imminent, then it wasn't imminent, and then last night, Biden made a statement that was imminent. I understand that the Americans have some form of intelligence, which I know not, which suggests that the threat is imminent. I don't see anything available in open sources that suggest that we're in a more tense situation than we were 2 or 3 weeks ago. In fact, if you look outside of security briefings, which I don't see or don't get as a businessman, what you see is, in fact, a diplomatic pathway that has more road to run. And it's also very clear from reading the Russian colleagues, and like you, I've met with many of the Russian colleagues, some of them from the Kremlin in the past, and there are elements you take seriously about the things that they say. There are things that are not serious, then there are things that are very important. Well, they're very important at the moment. They're very clear in describing two factors. One, that they have no intention of invading Ukraine. Two, that their concerns should be taken seriously. And three, that they may, if there is no movement from the collective West, move forward with technical and military action. But we don't know what those are. So the Americans seem to feel that they have something that suggests the threat is here, whereas the diplomatic environment looks as though there's a significant diplomatic engagement across a number of platforms, across a number of countries, which may lead at some point to better understanding and possibly a diplomatic route out of the impasse. At the moment, I personally don't feel that the tension has increased other than the statement from Biden. And that comes without any substance other than what he and perhaps the American intelligence services know. And we won't get that information.
I mean, the promises or the assurances coming from the Kremlin that, you know, we have no intention, they say it repeatedly. But that's in the West largely dismissed out of hand, that it doesn't mean anything. But are you saying that it's got a bit more store, or what sort of weight do you think that has?
Well, you know, you're a Russian expert, probably a better Russian expert than I. There's one thing that I've learned on my experience is that there are times when the Russians say something and they repeat it and they mean it. I am placing my money on the fact that this time they mean that. Now, that doesn't preclude the fact that at some point they can change that narrative. And, you know, there has been wide reporting of the possibility of sort of, you know, black flag events where there's the so-called provocation, and then they can say, well, that changed the rules, and so we had to act. Of course, that's possible, but it doesn't seem to be their intention from the way in which they're speaking presently. And consequently, I think that they want to, if there is a point where they feel they've run out of diplomatic route, that they can't move forward, they may then take action. But for them, it's extremely important, I believe, to say that they took every action possible to resolve the situation through diplomatic means. And that seems to be what they're trying to do. Let me go back a bit. When we had the meeting of the deputy foreign ministers in Geneva, that was seen as being crucial. The next stage after that was the meeting of the foreign ministers, Blinken and Lavrov. Then there was on the 26th of January, the exchange of documents, the answers to their questions. Now, at any point there, you could have closed down the diplomatic pathway. It didn't close. It remained open. Indeed, discussions over Normandy and the implementation of Minsk using the Normandy format of talks came into play. And that's still in play. And as we know, there was a discussion in Moscow on Tuesday, and there are different versions of that discussion. Perhaps the Macron version is more positive than the Moscow version. But nonetheless, there was a sense that was more road to run on Minsk. We had the end of 9 hours of talks on Minsk in the Normandy format yesterday in Berlin, near you. That ended without agreement, but it didn't end up with people saying there is no agreement, the process is closed. It came back with them, we'll try and find more work, we'll try and find a way, we'll try and talk. So
no, indeed.
as long as
it just came up on the wires that the Ukrainian representative said actually these talks are going to be frequent now, which is
yes, indeed
positive side.
And I heard different reports. One said the next talks will take place in March. Another report said there was no date fixed. Anyway, my view is that there seems to be diplomatic diplomatic moves ahead, and we haven't yet run out of diplomatic runway. And as long as that's the case, I am pretty certain that Russia will not look towards using any type of physical aggression against Ukraine during that period. Again, right, so hybrid war is in place all of the time and every day, and has been for 8 years. But when we talk about, sorry, you go on.
Well, I was going to ask, because I mean, look, what you're arguing, to step back a bit, this whole debate, and I'm looking at some of the people who have joined us, and there's some people in there who take an opposite side. There's two ways of looking at this. That this whole dispute is about Putin's ambitions for Ukraine, that he doesn't see it as a real country, and that he is intent on at least bringing it back into Russia's sphere of influence, if not actually taking it over. The other point of view is that this is all about NATO. That Putin is what it says on the can, that Putin wants a security deal, that the current setup with NATO excludes Russia. It de facto defines Russia as the enemy. And they're saying that we're not best friends, but you know, we want to do business with you. We've all got houses in Maida Vale in London and Grosvenor Square, and we spend quite a lot of time there. And we just want a security deal that doesn't threaten us, doesn't point weapons at us. If you believe the latter, when Russia says that it won't invade, then that's probably sincere, because all it's doing is rattling its saber in order to get people to come to the negotiating table, because they tried this before in 2008 and were ignored with a security deal then. And this time, Putin's already succeeded. Those talks have now started. If you believe the former, that it's all that Putin doesn't see Ukraine as a real country, then it's lies, because what will come at some point, it's some sort of action to, in some way, return Ukraine to Russia's sphere of influence. That could be military action, which would produce maybe a Minsk III, which would be then forced on the Zelensky government, and then that would take Ukraine, I don't know, make it neutral, or Donbass would become autonomous. I mean, which side of those two do you sit? Those two views?
Well, it's somewhere in between, Frank. Somewhere in between, frankly, Ben. Yeah, because firstly, you know, a successful Ukraine with increasing living standards, with improved healthcare, with rising pensions, with improved real incomes for citizens, with access to the West, with free travel, which is already in place to the European Union and other countries. That's a risk for the Kremlin administration, simply because it's a question of which system works. If you can look over the fence at your younger brother, and your younger brother's got a better car, bigger house, better healthcare, and bigger pension, you're going to be asking, why isn't that us? As we are bigger and we have the resources. And that's not something that's deniable through time. So it creates a risk. And so there is an element about trying to hamper Ukraine's European integration and its westward direction. Regrettably, choosing to fight with Ukraine, either in cyber war or in a kinetic conflict, only distance Ukraine and Ukrainians from Russians, who are essentially their neighbors and brothers and friends, or at least they were until 2014. So there is an element about Ukraine's success and how it might look. The second element is the security question, which is, I think, a real question. And here you get a clash of cultures. And it's here where Ukraine isn't the issue. It's the Western security dynamic, where really you have the democratic West, whole and free, rule of law, values, democracy, freedom. On the other side, you have Russia, which is essentially an empire. Russia has gone from one version of an empire to another version of empire, from the Tsarist empire to the Soviet empire to the post-Soviet empire. And it has longer term thinking. And here I have some space with the Russians. The security threats to Russia have primarily come from the West. They've come from us, whether it's the Napoleonic Wars, the First World War, the Second World War. We have been the threat, the collective West. And so Russia thinks like that. And it's in the Russian soul to think of protecting Mother Russia. And so they don't have our view. They don't absorb our view of NATO being a defensive alliance. Consequently, they want assurances as to their own security. Now, we find that hard because we're nice people. We obey the rules. We obey the rule of law. We're democracies. We have values. Yeah, but in the last, since 1812, one part of us or another has invaded Russia. They remember that. That's a real risk for them in a way that it wouldn't be a real risk for us.
Do you, because there's this thing about Mike McFaul, the former ambassador to Moscow, has made this point very strongly that he says it's not about NATO, it's about Putin is afraid of a democratic Ukraine. And then there's those of us who watch Ukraine and we're like, democracy in Ukraine doesn't really work very well. I mean, it's working.
Democracy doesn't work very well anywhere. It's just the least worst.
But
I'm not sure it's that much worse in Ukraine than anywhere else. And I speak as a British citizen.
But look, as a long-term resident of Ukraine and someone who knows Eastern Europe well, to what extent is there a difference between Ukraine as a democracy and Russia? I mean, in Russia, it's sort of fake Potemkin democracy, an anocracy, if you will. But to what extent would you characterize that Ukraine's actually made? How much progress down that path has it made?
I think it's made enormous progress in the time I've been here. And it's made it sometimes in extremis, where it could have chosen the wrong path, whether that was the Orange Revolution in 2004, or whether it was the Maidan Revolution in 2013-14. Democracy and the freedom to express your opinion freely is crucial in Ukraine. Now, there are many flaws to democracy, and indeed in Ukraine, but it is a real, rather kind of at times jagged and visceral democracy, but it is a democracy.
But the people value it. The people value it.
It's not perfect. No democracy is.
No, indeed.
It's immature. It has distance to travel. But compared to Russia, where I've also worked, it's radically different. People say their media is controlled here. Well, maybe, but there's so many different media that you can't control the media. There is real media freedom here, whether people like it or not. And I speak as someone who works with a person who often comes under great criticism from the media. I can be sure that the media is free, and I couldn't say that. I couldn't possibly say that about Russia. I couldn't say there were real free democratic parties.
And while we're talking about society,
the case. So it's radically different in terms of freedom and democracy, and it's moving further in the Western European model.
You mentioned earlier that there's been a changing attitude amongst Ukrainians towards Russia, because there are two peoples that are culturally joined at the hip. However, because of all this nastiness starting in 2014, the popularity of joining the EU was there from the beginning, but now the idea of joining NATO has become popular. I remember in Tymoshenko's day that she didn't even dare mention NATO because everyone had been brought up with NATO as the enemy, and so the government didn't even float the idea, and that's still true in Russia. But all of this conflict and Russia's bullying, to what extent has it disillusioned Ukrainians towards their brothers in Russia?
I think Ukrainians think differently. The viewpoint is they're very able to distinguish, in most cases, the difference between the actions of the Russian government and the actions of individual Russian citizens. Now, there are instances where families have fallen out over issues, for example, of the invasion of Donbass, the occupation of Donbass by Russian separatists, Russian-backed separatists. That has caused divisions in families between what is true and what is false. But on a normal, everyday level, Ukrainians don't have any beef with Russian citizens. And they are able to distinguish the difference between governments and the view of the Russian government as opposed to Russian people. And those links still remain strong. And
I know lots of Russians who are completely uncomfortable with the whole fighting in Donbass. They don't like it either. But what about the government? Let's move on to that, because although the West has been hyping this up or writing a lot about it, at least.
Yes.
Zelensky himself came out with that presser, I think 2 weeks ago, where he said, like, calm, actually, the situation is stable. Nothing has changed since 2014. And this was dismissed by a lot of people in the West as him just talking up the markets, trying to keep the lid on any panic, and that this was just normal politics. But, you know, where I see it, it looked fairly sincere. I mean, to what extent is the government alarmed by the Western reporting? To what extent does it buy into it? Because the signals coming out of Kyiv are actually kind of mixed. What are the government saying? That what's your takeaway on
it? The government speak about it in a less sensationalist format than Western media reporting on it, by and large. They talk in a balanced way now about the buildup of troops, the number of troops, and the potential for conflict. However, you wouldn't hear a Ukrainian minister or the president saying, as you heard President Biden say last night, that invasion was imminent, because actually they don't have that information and they don't have that perspective. So I think that
but surely
presentations by the president,
it's got its own intelligence services. I mean, and they must know it.
They are giving a different briefing. They're giving a different briefing internally, which says that there is not the imminent sense of invasion. Certainly not that which is coming from the United States. We don't have access to that on either side, so I don't know. I can only say that, one, it's sensible that the president suggests that we should remain calm, because frankly, panic achieves nothing. But we should be aware, and I think now they're making people aware. We've had testing of the alarm systems in Kyiv, site-improved signage so we know where to go if there should be an aerial attack. There is preparations underway should the security situation deteriorate, but there isn't a sense of panic. There is a sense of resignation that this may happen, but there isn't a sense of panic. And I think if you increase the threat to the point of view that people believe that tomorrow a war will begin, that isn't the sense that we have, and it's not the sense that one gets from a reading of the diplomatic track at the moment. So I think that the president.
At the same time, the president's not saying it's not going to, the West are hyping this, because there was a suggestion that he thinks it's getting out of hand on the Western reporting. And that,
there was a sense that was being sensationalist. And the dialogue from Western media and some Western politicians was sort of placing Ukraine into a sense of threat that wasn't yet realized, wasn't really in existence, that it was amping up the temperature too high vis-a-vis the reality of the situation on the ground. And I think that they were seeking to sort of to dial back that sense of imminent invasion and focus more on the question of dialogue. And I think that seems to be the correct approach the government's taking at this point. It's not that Ukrainians are unaware of the threat of conflict. It's just that they are being calmly and sensibly preparing themselves should the worst take place.
Do you think with Zelensky's position here, I mean, he's actually caught in a bind, because on the one hand, he's got to keep the people calm. On the other hand, he's got the Americans in particular pushing this whole Russia aggression thing very aggressively, in so much as a lot of the news is being generated by US intelligence coming out of Washington. We don't see the kind of troop movements that we saw in April on social media. Social media reporting, citizen reporting, if you like, is actually kind of calm. And it leaves me with the sense that this is, to some extent, a phony war. But at the same time, as we said before, Putin's clearly interested in hyping this up, of making a credible threat in order to get these negotiations to go. And what's the government's view then? Because a lot of these talks, I mean, if you look at the Geneva round in January, that Ukraine wasn't involved. It didn't participate.
Well, if we take a step back,
stuff.
It is, and this is the point. If we take a step back and look at this, we're talking about a conflict which could happen in Ukraine. But what is it that Russia wants? Now, you mentioned Mike McFaul, and my view too would be that they don't want a successful, democratic, European-orientated, rule of law-based Ukraine, because that could be a danger. But that's not their biggest concern. Their biggest concern, I think, truly is the question of security. And they've placed themselves in a position where they can now make a challenge of the current security order. And they've placed themselves in that position. Russia's placed itself in that position very carefully by investing significantly in training and rearmament, investing in improving its hydrocarbon economy, particularly the pipeline Nord Stream 2 to Germany, and vitally and I think you wrote about this recently, in ensuring they don't have a significant stockpile of capital in the Strategic Investment Fund, $640 billion and rising, to be able to cope with any of the sanctions.
Indeed.
On the other side, it looks at the time. It looks at what happened during the first 2 years of Zelensky's presidency, where the Russians claim that there hasn't been real engagement, there hasn't been the process haven't been followed up. Minsk has not been delivered on, which they had high hopes of. And then they look broader. And when they look more broadly and they say, hey, look, there's a new American president who's pivoting more to the Pacific than to Europe. We have decisions over Afghanistan that, when someone says they're going to stand behind you, well, they stand behind you and left in the case of Afghanistan, even though the British wished to remain, Americans wished to go, and go they did. And we saw that as I would say, a very messy catastrophe, really, for the international community in the manner in which it stands behind those that it claims to stand behind. That's a message that was well received and understood in the Kremlin with regard to real hard security intent on behalf of their allies and NATO countries. Then we look at the European Union struggling to deal with the impact of COVID. We see Chancellor Merkel shuffling off the stage, and a new guy coming in from the SPD, who you will be familiar with and know that may not be a good signal. And we can maybe ask you about that in a moment, because I think you know more about it than I do. And then
he'll be there next week.
He will, after he's been to Moscow. I don't know if he's going before or after, but I know it's the same trip. So you have a Europe that's weakened. You have Brexit, with the European Union losing perhaps one of its strongest economic and security partners, the United Kingdom. You have a leaderless Europe, with Macron now trying to fill that gap. You have a United Kingdom potentially humbled by leaving the European Union and COVID and the economic impact of that. What you have is NATO and NATO proxy countries in weakness. And if you're a strong security player like Putin, you look at that and say, this may be my opportunity to achieve what I believe is a crucial security objective for my nation. And I'm going to prosecute that right now.
Yeah, I agree. If you were Putin and you genuinely believe this thing that he's always had this bee in the bonnet about NATO and he wants to do something about it, now is the perfect time. I mean, the Biden particularly, the point with him to note is that the US has had this policy of withdrawing from these Cold War era missile treaties. And Biden was against that as a senator. And the first thing he did in the first week in the office was to renew the START 3 treaty. And he said very clearly, we want to do arms controls. And the Kremlin has said very clearly, we want to do arms controls. So there is some common ground. But I wanted to ask, I wanted to talk about business, but quickly, one last thing on the general politics.
Yeah.
That this began in Geneva very clearly with Ryabkov demanding from Sherman that no NATO, ever, 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 never, never, watertight, ironclad. And that's not going to fly. I don't see how going to make that happen. But then the new thing that Macron has introduced is to focus more on Normandy 4. And there the idea would be actually to implement the Minsk II agreements, because that's also a solution to this. And so much as part of that means that Donbass has to become autonomous, change the constitution, and an autonomous Donbass, which is de facto under Russia's control, can veto Ukraine membership to NATO at any point. And the Kremlin, I think, would accept that as a solution because they're also pushing for it. So the Kremlin wants it, the West wants it. It's actually, it was Merkel that pushed that deal through. And these Normandy talks have suddenly restarted, and quite vigorously as well. I mean, they're not getting anywhere. Like you say, yesterday, the 9 hours of talks at Kozlov said, like, we were just banging our heads against a brick wall, the Ukrainians weren't moving. But my question to you is, it's been said to me that it's an impossible sell, Minsk II, that you cannot implement it because the Ukrainian people will not accept it, and that Kyiv and Zelensky's government and Poroshenko's government are dead set against them, despite the fact that they've been signed off on, and despite the fact that all of the partners, including Russia, are pushing for them. What would happen if they try to push that through?
The big difficulty here is that the Ukrainians signed Minsk I and Minsk II. But I've been in track 1.5 and track 2 peace discussions with the other party, with the Russians. The interpretation placed on the 13 clauses of Minsk between the two sides is radically different. The Russians interpret it as a semi-autonomous Donbass with the ability to potentially veto strategic interests of Ukraine, including membership of the European Union and NATO. On the other side, you have the Ukrainian viewpoint. That is, we agreed to decentralization. We're carrying out decentralization across Ukraine, and Donbass will receive that decentralization. What is unacceptable politically, even if they've signed up for it, which they have, is for a Ukrainian leader in the current political environment to be able to give that right of veto to an occupied Donbass, which will essentially be under Russian control, as you say, not least of which because of the 8 years of negative propaganda against Ukraine, describing it absolutely incorrectly and falsely as a fascist state. Secondly, you have passportization with over 750,000 passports issued to Ukrainians.
Half the population there.
Exactly. So that is a huge stumbling block. And of course, those aspects, certainly the passportization was against Minsk. It should not have happened. It's against the spirit of the agreement, although passportization isn't mentioned specifically in the 13 points. So it's very hard for Ukraine to find any Ukrainian president. I'm not being critical of this one or of Mr. Poroshenko. It's very hard for any Ukrainian president to find a format of self-governance and semi-autonomous nature for the currently occupied territories of Lugansk and Donetsk that will be acceptable broadly to the Ukrainian public. And, real politics at play, midterm is a very bad time to attempt to do something as strategically difficult as that trick.
So you think
it's problematic.
My feeling is that it is a solution. It's an easier sell than offering some sort of guarantee that Ukraine can never join NATO by the NATO members themselves. But in practice, it seems to be unworkable. But would there be protests? I mean, would there be a large-scale uprising if
there would be protests? And I fear it's likely there would be protests. Most analysts, I'm not an expert on this issue of the internal right wing and the army, the internal right wing, right-wing militias, but they do exist. There's enough documentation on it. I think that it is dangerous for Ukraine to go down that pathway. without really explaining it in advance and in detail to the country and consulting the country if it chose to go down that pathway, if a form of words could be found. It certainly offers a diplomatic route. It's a question whether that diplomatic route, which looks straightforward, as you say, can be delivered in the complex world of real politics.
And like you say, at this point in the election cycle for Zelensky, it would be death. I mean, it was suicide. He wouldn't get re-elected.
It could be an extremely destructive force in Ukrainian domestic politics, not just for him.
Let's switch tacks.
Yes.
Put your SCM hat on. And look at this whole situation from the point of view of big business. And my impression is, at the end of the day, big business is agnostic to all this politics. You know, they're in business to make money, profits, invest, and sell to whoever will buy products. But to what extent is this divorce between Russia and Ukraine and the sanctions? And at the other side of the fence, the EU, Ukraine is not a member, has no prospects of becoming a member. The quotas that it have are tiny. So the access it gets to the European Union on preferential terms is very limited. How destructive is this for business? How difficult is it to make plans? What's the strategic thinking about this?
So I think the first thing, you're right. Business likes to have clear rules of the game. It likes stability, and it likes a stable political and economic environment, so it can go on investing and developing and growing. And we haven't had that. Now, the external risk of posed by the current situation with Russia makes it difficult for businesses, firstly, when they wish to access capital markets, because clearly any bank or any investor is going to look at that and say, I'm not sure we can support this presently. So if you're looking to recapitalize, then that's a challenge. The second point would be foreign direct investment. Ukraine is starved of foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment was beginning to return later in 2021, but that will be put behind. That won't happen now. We understand fully, as an economist, which is my original training, you look outside and you see simply when the possibility of investing in Ukraine goes towards a credit committee, when stories of a potential conflict on that territory are the front page of newspapers, the top of social media feeds, and the lead in TV news, that credit committees are going to have a lot of questions of whether they will make that investment. So it stalls foreign direct investment. It also devalues the value of existing bonds, which are in the marketplace due to the threat of risk. So when you look at it, it damages the business and investment climate. And when I mentioned earlier, it reduces the availability of FDI and capital, and it increases the costs.
And are those, but a business like SCM, I mean, and most of Eastern Europe, the bulk of investment is done out of retained earnings, but which also favors the large companies. But
well, it's not. Most of it is done through a combination of retained earnings and money raised in the capital markets. So you need both to be able to move forward. Ideally, in most cases, the ideal is three. One is retained earnings, two is capital raised in capital markets, and three is strategic partners. When you have those three, you have certainly the conditions for very successful investment. All three are undermined by continued security risk.
If you take the view that Putin wants to basically hobble Ukraine and stop it becoming a success, then he's already succeeded, in so much as I keep saying that Ukraine should be the best investment story in the whole former Soviet Union, because it's the only country that has not done the catch-up growth. It's been 20 years in a mess, and with these new governments, and a reform-minded government, it should be, like Uzbekistan, attracting significant amounts of capital because of the geography as well.
I think that without COVID, Ukraine was in a position at that point in March 2020 when the investment climate really could have taken off particularly because of the desire to go to do nearshoring away from China, and particularly for European supply chains to bring that closer to home. And already Ukraine was seeing a significant influx of nearshore investors, particularly those coming from Germany and Poland. And I think that this type of conflict threat undermines that story. I also think that Ukraine has done well in the 16 years I've lived here. It's just that it's failed to make the speed of transformation that was possible. But we had a sense that maybe that speed could be picked up, particularly as we had a government that said it was backing reform and would make FDI a priority, and had a target of 6% GDP growth per annum. That hasn't happened. But we have to say, COVID also intervened into that. But there are also some really rather poor decisions, for example, with regard to renewable energy, which was booming, but then the government chose to independently and unilaterally change the existing agreement with investors. And that significantly undermined investor confidence in what had been a successful marketplace. Nonetheless, investors were coming in.
That was the one sector. There was, I think the year before, there was zero FDI. But the green energy has been the one sector which has attracted significant FDI
until that point of the changing unilaterally the tariffs.
But that was also a failure of the energy reforms, wasn't it? The general, what's it called? The general purchasing body basically hadn't got any money and it couldn't pay the bills because the green tariffs were too high.
Yes, it's a sort of mismanagement of the energy sector, frankly, in some cases. With corruption and mismanagement, particularly in the state-owned sector, and
how would you
subsidizing energy costs?
Yes,
not for poor citizens who do need assistance, but for some businesses who don't need assistance at all. They just need to pay commercial rates properly.
Because the reform agenda is a mixed bag. So I'd be quite critical of the energy reforms that wasn't done well.
Yeah.
And we ended up with this huge disaster in green energy tariff story. But something like the banking sector has been transformed, and that's looking fantastic. That was really good.
That was good. But that was work done by Petro Poroshenko and the former NBU governor. It was done very well, and it is a success story. We have one of the top 10 banks in Ukraine, First Ukrainian International Bank. And we absolutely welcomed the reforms that took place in the sector. It really made a significant difference on the stability of the banking sector. And then as the banks properly capitalized, the ability of the banks to then support lending in the real economy. So I think it was rightly pointed out, has been a huge success.
No, and the banking sector sailed through last year's crisis and even increased profits year on year. Not by much, but they did. And RInat Bank too. That's now the most profitable bank in the country, despite all the problems it had. So, as a businessman,
as it should be.
Yeah, as a businessman, how would you characterize the reforms? Is the business operation and the business climate, is it improving as a result of all these
I really think that this government certainly tackled corruption, and we see a reduction in the level of corruption in Ukraine, and that's a plus. I think the reform in the energy sector, where really all you need to do is follow the European Union elements of the European Union Association Agreement and the European Energy Community Treaty, follow those chapters, and it's successful. That hasn't been done so because of an attempt to manually manage elements in the energy sector for reasons unknown as to why one would wish to do that. I leave others to speculate on that question. I think that what has been regrettably a failure is the rule of law. I've been here 16 years. If I spoke to my boss, Mr. Akhmetov, he would say, I remember him telling me like 15 years ago, what was the most important thing we needed? He said, we need to have reform the judiciary and the rule of law. And you know what? We still need it. It is still the largest single aspect that holds back investors from investing in Ukraine. The fear that they simply will not get the returns that they deserve, and that their money is in some way unsafe in an environment where the courts are not independent and don't make decisions based purely on legal questions. And I would just add, I'm also the deputy chair of the British Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, and we have some ideas, for example, bringing in a legal ombudsman that could oversee these courts to check that decisions that were made were true legal decisions based on the fact and not as a result of the legal equivalent of checkbook journalism.
Mm. So that makes a nice segue into the last topic I wanted to cover briefly, this whole campaign against the oligarchs. Zelensky gave a speech in March where he basically launched a campaign, and then there's been a number of like anti-Kolomoisky laws, there's been an anti-Akhmetov law, where they're trying to make a register, as far as I understand, of oligarchs and who are not allowed to have direct contact with government. And how does an oligarch, Akhmetov in particular, see all of this? I mean, it's kind of like discriminatory, but at the same time, you're just talking about the judicial system is wide open to abuse and is
absolutely
abused. And I look at Mr. Kolomoisky as a good example. I mean, he quite blatantly has got the courts in his pockets when this whole campaign to get Privat Bank back. So how do you operate an environment like that?
So if we want to address the oligarch law, firstly, look, Mr. Akhmetov and SCM, Mr. Akhmetov isn't an oligarch. That'd be his viewpoint. And I'll tell you why it's right is, why do we describe people who run their business legally, who are the biggest taxpayers in the country, who have the best corporate governance in Ukraine, why are they oligarchs? They're investors. In our case, the largest domestic investor in Ukraine, we're a strategic investor that makes most of our investment inside Ukraine, no matter what the circumstances. We are loyal to Ukraine and its economy because we see the potential. As long as that potential remains, we will continue to invest in this country. So what happens if you designate the country's largest private sector investor, who invests almost double that EBRD does, if you designate that person as an oligarch, you then limit that person's ability to raise money and invest.
Yeah.
You discriminate against them. You undermine their human rights. You destroy the domestic investment environment. This is a piece of political theatre. What you really need to do is make transparent decisions, improve the rule of law, and fight corruption. Putting 13 people on a list and call them oligarchs is play school politics. It's not reform. It's not change. It's fake.
I understand. I think the solution which you're suggesting should be to have a functionary, transparent judiciary and just everybody in front of the law.
Absolutely. Rule of law.
But that's not working. And
so far.
Yeah, indeed. And the government's to blame for not pushing through these judicial reforms. It's a huge problem.
Because
but at the
it
same
hasn't
time,
pushed it as hard as it should do. And I think that that's where we need to focus our effort. If we want to get those FDI numbers up and the GDP numbers up, then that's what one has to do.
I agree. But I mean, there's two things here. You can look at it in an ideological point of view, and obviously having a transparent and clean and honest judiciary would be the way to go. And that is the solution in the long term.
Indeed. Yeah.
In the short term, I think the oligarch law is like a pragmatic step, because the judiciary is partly so corrupt because oligarchs pay the judges all this money and pervert the decisions. And so you saw last year when Zelensky had that showdown with the Constitutional Court, that his hands were tied because on the one hand, he has to keep to the letter of the law, but on the other hand, the judges were clearly corrupt and he needs to get them out, but he hasn't got the constitutional power to do that. And it's the same with the oligarchs. On the one hand, they produce IFSR accounts and they stick to the rule of law, publicly. But on the other hand, you've got someone like Kolomoisky going around the back and handing a bunch of judges a whole bunch of money to get a decision that he wants. And everybody knows that goes on. And how do you deal with that?
If there are bad actors, it does go round to the question of this confluence of two crucial issues that all investors talk about, which is corruption and the rule of law. So let's take the example. How do you tackle it? Well, actually, you prosecute people who pursue corrupt schemes. So you investigate them. That's fighting corruption. And then you put them in front of the courts. That's the judicial system. Now, you mentioned a person, I won't repeat his name, but if that is a bad actor, you don't take 13 people who could be the biggest investors in the country and say you're all bad. I mean, that's lazy. You don't. You take the tough decision. You actually go after the person who's wrong. You don't write a list like writing to Santa Claus for Christmas.
Indeed.
You find out where the problem is and you resolve it. And that's why this isn't effective. Yeah. It's a smoke screen. Everybody that I know, I mean, I know some of those people on the list and have spoken with them in the past. These are business people. They respect the rule of law. And I believe that if that's in place, then there's no need for this type of shopping list that is primarily political and deeply ineffective. And behind the scenes, if you speak with, let's say, diplomats and bankers and so on, they understand that this oligarch law is a piece of ineffectual legislation that is in essence populist in its nature. What we really need is change.
What about change the topic slightly and talking about oligarchs? The other problem is that they fund the political careers of a lot of the deputies in the Rada. And they form blocks in strategic places on strategic committees.
Yes.
In order to shape the laws, to their advantage, and also to block things that they don't want to see go through. And there's again the anti-Kolomoisky law. Suddenly, it had 16,000 amendments, which would have taken 2 years to actually review, until they had to come back and change the law, allowed to do review and block. But this is also a problem because the political system itself is corrupt. Because of the oligarch money that's gone into the Rada to back, and we saw this in Russia as well. I mean, Putin cleaned that out. That's the advantage of being authoritarian, that he got rid of that. But in Ukraine, it's still a cancer, isn't it?
I have to say that, after the last elections, I can say that there are 6 MPs that are known to Mr. Akhmetov, and the relationship with them is well known. We're not funding MPs. We're not paying politicians. That's not what we're doing. I can't say the same for others. They have their own problems. They have their own solutions. But we would say that if you're paying politicians with brown envelopes, then that's not the way forward. That simply undermines democracy. That's not good for business. I would agree, and I know Mr. Akhmetov would agree, that what you need is a clear division between politics and business. Get back, move to the European format where we lobby in a transparent way with government, with politicians. That's honest. And that's what we try to do as a business group. And it's one of the jobs that I have as Director of International and Investor Relations to do that. For example, if I go to Brussels, I've had to sign the Transparency Register, which asks me to clearly state on behalf of the group what we lobby for, which issues we're interested in, how much money we spend on it. It's a transparent process. No one questions that there is corrupt payment, because there isn't. And we need to move to that system in Ukraine. And I think that we're ahead of the game in that, in now not supporting at any point politicians and political parties. That link needs to be dissolved, and it should happen across the board, and we would see a much better performance. But I would again, Ben, I find that when one uses the word oligarch, it's a bit lazy. I'm not just having a go at you here, but
no, it's a loaded term.
Corruption where it exists inside society in Ukraine, where it exists, it's a broad issue. It's not 13 people you can put on a list. Much better to respect people individually for what they do individually, for their values individually, and make the right decisions. Calling people oligarchs allows politicians to subvert their responsibility. They're able to say, it wasn't me. It wasn't what I didn't do. It was them. And to give it a big name means you can point the blame at someone else. Each business group and each businessman and investor, like Mr. Akhmetov, should be responsible for what they do. The collective noun oligarch fails to get to the point of responsibility. And I think that we need to get to that point of responsibility. And that will create change, holding people accountable.
We're just about out of time. I was going to do, well, look, we have one question from Johannes Anderson, who I think you know.
I do.
And he's asking a practical question, an interesting one. Metinvest exports that the steel goes out through, I think it's Mariupol, isn't it?
Yes.
Sea of Azov, and that's just been closed down for these live fire.
Well, that's very confusing because they've had two different reports on that today. So I'm going to start with I don't know, but yes, there was a point that it was closed. Then I saw a cable from the Russians that said it wasn't closed and that the military exercise in the Azov were not taking place. And so I don't know if that's closed or not. What I can say is that we've been here before with Metinvest and others and having to ship goods out of the Azov Sea, and we've been able to do so. Sometimes it's taken longer if there's been political tension to ship those goods. When it's not been possible to ship the goods, then it is possible for us to move the goods through other routes, through Black Sea ports. So it doesn't prevent exports, but it can make them more expensive if that blockade is in place and stays in place. But as I say, it's not clear at the moment from everything that I've read today whether that's the case.
And in general, I mean, how disruptive is that? I mean, when the Kerch Straits were closed, that
it adds time and cost, basically. These are elements of like hybrid war. You make things more difficult, you make them more challenging. It adds cost because you then ship the goods by rail to a Black Sea port, deep sea port, and then ship them on from there. At the moment, we have, I think, Metinvest has got about 10 Handymax vessels running a sort of shuttle service to Europe and to, of course, the Black Sea and to the Middle East and North Africa, taking goods directly from Mariupol to customers. So it's possible without it. But it improves, it extends the logistic chain, and it can cost. And of course, steel is competitive. So every time someone puts $1 on the cost of the steel, you become less competitive.
Yeah. Look, Jock, we've run out of time. We've been talking for an hour. Extremely interesting. I hope you don't end up in your basement living on cold baked beans for the next month or Valentine's Day.
I hope not. I hope not. Yeah, but one has to remain optimistic but realistic in circumstances.
Yeah,
I still believe that the chances are that we will, on balance, that I hope there will be enough diplomatic pathway and initiatives that may reach a conclusion that doesn't involve some type of conflict. We shall see.
Jock, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time. I'm really great to talk to you, and I hope next time
we'll
be over a beer in Kyiv itself.
I hope so. I hope to see you face to face again soon, Ben.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And to all our listeners, thank you so much for taking part, and I hope you enjoyed it and found it as interesting as I did, both of those on Twitter. I point you to BNE. We cover this story on a daily basis. We have correspondents everywhere, including 2 in Kyiv, who are following the story day to day. Our focus is more on business. If you go to IntelliNews.com/welcome, then you can find a link where you can take a trial to our premium service, which is in depth on Ukraine. And I'd also recommend you take a look at our editor's picks, which is a daily free email that I send out of the best stories we've done in the last 24 hours from the whole patch that we cover. And also a link to the BNE YouTube channel where you can see this podcast later and the previous ones. Last week we did a similar podcast that covered similar questions about Ukraine and the crisis, but then from Russian and focus on Russian business. So until next time, thank you once again for participating. All the best from me, Ben Aris.